Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do something a little bit different and we're going to take a look at some electoral reform that I propose for the Australian Parliament. So Anthony Albanese has floated the idea in the past of increasing the number of seats in Parliament. I believe the last significant time this happened was during the 1980s under Bob Hawke. So probably what he would do would increase the number of members of the House of Representatives to 180 single member electorates and then increase the size of the Senate to 90 or 92. That's assuming 14 seats for each state, plus either 3 or 4 for the territories. Currently, we have 151 seats in the House of Representatives and 76 seats in the Senate. The problem with that is that our population is growing. The number of constituents in each House of Representative seat is growing more and more as time goes on. And you would argue that you would need more members of parliament to deal with the fact that we have larger populations. The other issue with the House of Representatives, which has basically been a thing for a very long time, is that the Australian Constitution mandates that Tasmania have at least 5 seats. Now, 5 out of 150 is something like 3.5%, but Tasmania's population is closer to 2%. So Tasmania is actually massively overrepresented in both the House and the Senate. In the Senate, they have the same amount of seats as every other state, despite the fact that they are only slightly bigger than the ACT and the Northern Territory. But they have 6 times as many seats, so a lot of people say that's unfair. That's what the Constitution mandated. But you can fix the issue of Tasmania being overrepresented in the House by simply increasing the number of seats in the House, increasing the number of seats in the House to 180 and keeping Tasmania on 5 would still have them almost at 3% representation, which is still overrepresented. So today I am proposing a system which actually goes up to 222 seats, which is a lot more balanced in terms of representation of Tasmania. And I am also proposing a system where we get rid of single member constituencies and we instead have almost every constituency in the country elect 3 members, 3 or more members. We'll get to sort of the details in a second, but let's have a look at how this would kind of work. So basically, what I've done here as sort of an example is that I've combined every 2 current electorates in the country, and then I've had each new combined electorate elect 3 members, and the quota for this combined electorate is 25%. So you need 25% of the vote after preferences to get a seat. If you get 50% of the vote after preferences, you get 2 out of 3 seats. Now you might say, oh, that's unfair. You get half of the vote, but you get 2/3 of the seat. That's so unfair. Well, at the moment, the way the current system works is that if you get 50% of the vote after preferences, you get 100% of the seat. So this is a bit more representative. You'll see in a second, but the way that the system sort of resolves the way people vote is a little bit more representative compared to our current system. Bear with me here. I've tried to use how the 2022 elections would have gone under the new redistributions and use that to calculate these new seats. Trust me, it makes sense. So we have like seats like Kennedy in Queensland where Bob Katter still gets a seat, but then the Coalition Labor also get a seat. Then we have, say, Flynn and Clappercornia, where One Nation gets a seat at the expense of the Coalition, I guess. You have some seats which are sort of marginal, where there's like Labor versus One Nation for the final seat. Another seat by One Nation, Blair and Wright. That's actually the only 2 seats that One Nation wins in this model. But I assume that if One Nation knew that they had a chance of winning some more seats, maybe they would get a couple more seats. But I don't think they'd get that many more. Then you have a couple of seats where the Greens actually emerge, but they actually only win 3 seats in Queensland, just the same as IRL. It's just that it's over 3 different new combined electorates. But again, maybe if they knew that they could win more seats, they might end up winning seats like the merged seat of Bowman and Moreton, or maybe even some other Queensland seats. The names of the electorates, I actually worked this out a couple of months ago. So I can't exactly tell you the process of how I worked out these names, but basically what I tried to do was keep names of divisions that were founded at the beginning of Federation and also keep the divisions of deceased prime ministers. But in some cases, I had to sort of move them around where it seemed appropriate. Like, for example, here I've made McPherson and Moncrief forward. So there was a logical reason behind this. You'll just have to trust me. So you get some interesting results in South Australia, where the Greens actually get a seat here in Boothby and Sturt. What you're mostly seeing is that the Labor Party managed to sort of pick up seats where they often wouldn't win anything, and the coalition managed to do the same. They managed to pick up seats where they currently wouldn't have any representation. I think that's important because there is a percentage of these parts that actually do support Labor or the coalition and deserve some kind of representation. And there are still marginal seats. So if we go down to seats like Dobell and Robertson, I'd say that that would be pretty marginal. Especially seats like Lindsley and McMahon, which I've given to Labor, would actually be like really marginal. The difference would be that it would be the third seat in a lot of these divisions that would be marginal. Number one here, Hunter and Patterson would probably be sort of marginal. It's still the same situation where if a party wins more than 50% after preferences, then that's how they win a second seat, which is where sort of a lot of these marginal seats come in. But then you also have seats like Cowper, where I've given an independent one seat. I've had to make some sort of assumptions with some of these where, obviously an independent didn't run in two different seats in the federal election. So I've just had to make an assumption that they would do relatively well in an adjacent division as well. So maybe some of these assumptions are a bit wobbly. You've got some seats like McKellar and Warringah where the Labor Party actually misses out completely, where Independent gets 2 and the Liberals get 1. And you have a similar situation in Grayndler and Sydney where the Labor Party gets 2 and the Greens get 1. So the major parties won't be represented in every single division in the country. They're represented in most. Most are 2 for one, 1 for the other. But this does give a chance that if a minor party or an independent does have some significant support in some of these seats, they actually do have a good chance of winning in places where under the current system they would have no chance at all. So you're probably wondering how this would all look like on a map. This is the result that we have got. As you can see, I've given basically Alex Dyson a seat here at the expense of the Labor Party, but the seat in Cowper I've given at the expense of Coalition. And then you still have like independents winning seats here in Kooyong and Isaacs, like they do in a normal federal election as well as here in Curtin, Wentworth, Warringah, Bennelong. You'd actually probably get even more independents in a system like this because it does allow for independents to win on a smaller margin than otherwise. Like you'd probably likely see like the independent who ran in Nichols get up here in the combined seat of McEwen. I've given some of these sort of like interesting names. I've combined Melbourne and McNamara and called it Yarra. Try to avoid names that refer specifically to sort of like suburb or city names, but I'm still like referring to like geographical locations like Maribyrnong. But yeah, this obviously, this wouldn't be the result that you would have got in the 2022 election because the way major parties would have approached different electorates would have been different, and the way minor parties would have approached and independents would have approached different electorates would have been different. So I'm not saying that this is what the result would look like. As I said, you'd probably get a lot more minor parties and independents, but we do get a result from the 2022 election of the Labor Party getting 103 seats. The majority in this case is 112, so they miss out by about 10 seats, but they can still form government with the Greens or the Independents or a mix of independents and some of these minor parties. Oh, I accidentally marked a Senate Alliance as One Nation, so yeah, whoops, similar colors. And so yes, as I said earlier, the contest would be around for these third seats in places like Hasluck, or maybe even like here in Lingiari, or down here in Flinders. So it's not like there isn't marginal seats. And it's not like there won't be specific like divisions where it would be favorable for the major parties to specifically campaign there. Like there is still safe seats in this. I guess the difference is that there's always a contest which possibly might come up with an independent or a minor party, which would make the major parties work harder to actually keep a lot of the seats in areas where they usually would just say like, oh, that's a safe seat, it doesn't matter. We already kind of saw that with the current system in places like Fowler, which has been combined with Werriwa and turned into the seat of Whitlam. But you would definitely see a lot more of that kind of stuff in a system like this. So I just want to go over the advantages and the disadvantages. Obviously, the advantages are that you get a more representative parliament. The Labour Party only got about 33% of the vote and ended up with a majority of seats in Parliament, which some could argue is a little bit egregious, but that's just sort of how our current system works. Everyone knows it sort of works like that. So you can't exactly sort of complain about it when the current system is sort of meant to make majority governments while being far off getting a majority of primary votes. But this would give the Labour Party approximately 46.5% of seats instead of over 50%. So there isn't quite that massive difference between the number of seats in Parliament versus the number of primary votes. And actually, the coalition does a bit better. They get about 43% of seats. I think in our current system, the coalition only got about 37% of seats. So you could argue that this is a good or a bad thing, because you could argue that, oh, it's actually good that we have majority governments. It's good that it provides stability to the country. It makes it so that independents and Greens and stuff like that are not always like blocking legislation or trying to do deals and stuff like that. But you could argue, of course, that's a bad thing. And you can also argue that it's a good thing when the coalition sort of has like this significant swing against them in the two-party preferred. I think it was something like 3.5%. They get like pretty destroyed in the seat counts and the proportion of seats. While in this system, it's definitely moderated a fair bit where they hang on, because a lot of these places where they would get nothing, they actually get some seats, which is most, I think, noticeable in Melbourne, where there is a bit of blue here and there, whilst they got pretty destroyed in Melbourne in the actual 2022 federal election. However, I think the biggest arguments against this system are how it actually might affect independents and minor parties. Like, you could see how this would be beneficial, but might also be detrimental because of the fact that independents who want to represent as smaller of a region as possible, they want to be local members to a small area. It's much more difficult for them to fulfill that role when they have to focus on an electorate that's twice as big. Someone like Alex Dyson has like a massive electorate here. It's not just Wannon, it's also Mallee that he has to look after. That's a big part of Victoria, and a lot of people would argue that those two regions of Victoria don't actually really have that much in common. So there's actually no real point in merging them and having a representative for a combined region like that. And someone like Sophie Scamps or Zelly Stegel might be unhappy about not only competing against another independent, but also representing an area as large as the whole of the Northern Beaches. Just quickly, another issue with this system, in a seat like Warringah, if you wanted to kick out a member out of Parliament like Tony Abbott in 2019, it would be more difficult, because over the two seats of Warringah and Mackellar, Tony Abbott would just have to win 25% after preferences and he would still stay in Parliament, even if there is a big swing against him. If you wanted to decisively remove someone from Parliament, it would be more difficult, which some people would see as a disadvantage of the system. Another example is Josh Frydenberg in 2022. What the system does allow for in places like the combined Bradfield and Bennelong is for two independents to run and not necessarily step on each other's shoes. They could theoretically both get elected, as you can see here in Warringah. But it also means that they have, as I said, more ground to cover, and it might be harder to get elected when you might appeal to a certain demographic. And because the division is so large, that demographic is only situated in like half of the division, and the other half of the division has a very different demographic. So you might find that a bit frustrating in somewhere like the new seat of Bennelong, which combines Bradfield and Bennelong. So maybe some of these independents would actually argue for just an increase in parliament size to 225, and then have like much smaller electorates, and then you would get like local members really representing a more sort of homogenous area. I could see the argument for that, and you probably would get a lot more independents elected in that kind of system as well, but it still would require a higher quota. That might be okay for independents who roughly 50% of the electorate might feel all right about, but minor parties who people who are further from the center, those minor parties, I think it's more difficult for them in a system where they have to reach that 50%. I think getting that 25% is a lot more manageable for them. And so I think this kind of system, whilst might not be incredibly appetizing towards independence, would probably be better for minor parties. And the big winners you can see in this system are the Greens, who get more than twice the number of seats that they got in the 2022 federal election. And probably you would see a similar situation if we looked at like previous elections as well. And One Nation, who get currently no representation in the federal parliament in the House of Representatives, and suddenly they have 2 seats, and they could possibly get even more in places like Maranoa or Wide Bay, or possibly even in other parts of the country. Before we move on to the Senate, I just want to take a little look at how I think the ballot papers would work for this kind of system. So there's really 2 ways you could go about it. Is you could have this thing where you have above the line and below the line, and you could either vote for a party above the line or like individuals below the line. Obviously, parties really do prefer this system, but it becomes a problem when independents have to be below the line in this sort of ungrouped area, which makes you unable to vote for them above the line, which I think is kind of bullshit because most voters just like are inclined to vote above the line. So I would suggest that in a system like you should either have only below the line voting, or you should make it that independents, even if it's just one candidate, are allowed to run above the line and just have their own column to themselves, even though it's just one candidate. I think that's how you would make it fair. The other issue, I guess, is this system would make it very difficult to keep compulsory preferential voting, because you'd probably have a lot of candidates below the line. And if you kept compulsory preferential voting, if someone wanted to vote below the line, they would have to number every single candidate, which people, really don't want to do. So I guess my suggestion would be that for above the line, you have compulsory preferential voting. So you have to vote for every candidate. But if you want to do optional preferential voting, you can vote below the line and you have to number, say, at least 3 candidates. So it's sort of like a best of both worlds thing. I'm trying to sort of appease everyone. But it's really important, in my opinion, that independents are not disenfranchised, and you don't have it that the only way you can vote for independents is vote below the line. I really don't like that. Also, these are 3 here for the system I'm suggesting. Obviously, you need to put like 4 and 5 for the ACT and Tasmania. So you may have noticed that in Tasmania and the ACT, I have here 4 here for Fraser and 5 here for Lions. That is because these 2 entities, I guess you could call them, both have an odd number of seats. So I couldn't really combine 2 into 3 effectively. So I've just made it so that they're one giant constituency, and the ACT elects 4 and Tasmania elects 5. You could have something even in legislation saying that an entity has to have at least 6 seats appointed to it before it can become 2 different constituencies. Or you could round up Tasmania to 6 and lower the ACT to 3, or round up ACT to 6 as well. But 5 seats out of 222 is still higher than what proportion Tasmania actually deserves. Same for ACT, and same for 3 seats in the Northern Territory. I also just want to mention that the Greens could have a chance in both the NT and Tasmania if we did things through Senate results. But strictly by the House, I've given a seat here to Andrew Wilkie and given the Labor Party and Coalition 2 seats in Tasmania, and 2 seats for the Labor Party, and 1 seat for the Coalition in Northern Territory. I think Labor Party do this well in the Northern Territory in the House because there is an element of personal vote. So moving on to the Senate, I have expanded the Senate to 114 members, which is 18 in every state and 3 in both territories. You could make an argument for having 4 in both territories. And in fact, they were actually proposing to increase the number of senators in both territories to 4, whilst also keeping the number of House of Representatives the same. So I guess if we did increase the number of senators and House of Representative seats, you probably would end up getting 4. But I've kept it as 3 because both of the territories are still actually overrepresented with 3 seats. I guess the argument for giving them more seats is where the Senate is supposed to give like the smaller areas higher representation than they deserve, such as Tasmania. But the territories, they're not states. They're not states. They don't have that same entitlement as Tasmania or South Australia or Western Australia. So it's really just up to your sort of ideology whether or not you think like the territories deserve 3 or 4 or 6 seats or whatever. There's nothing in the Constitution which says anything about the territories getting X amount of seats versus the Senate seats. I believe that the territory seats only came in during the Whitlam government in the 70s. What this does do is it lowers the quota for half Senate elections for the states to 10%, and in double dissolutions, it's a bit over 5%. And in the territories, the quota is 25%, just like most of the House of Representatives seats in this new system. If there was 4 seats in each territory, I think the last seat here would probably go to Labor. I think if there was 5, it would be the Liberal Democrats / Libertarians. Actually, it would be more likely the other way around. The Libertarians would win the 4th seat and the Labor Party would win a potential 5th seat. And in the ACT, I think it would also go to Labor. Actually, the Greens could actually win that 4th seat and Labor win a potential 5th seat. I highly doubt that the coalition would ever want to increase the number of seats in Parliament any further. A, because they're a Conservative party, and B, because they just believe in quote-unquote small government, so they think like the less number of members of Parliament, the better. So yeah, it'd probably be the Labor Party doing that. Anyway, so what kind of results you get here is me looking at the 2019 elections and the 2022 elections and just doing a bit of math and working out what I think would have been the result if the quota was lowered to 10% for each election. I have sort of taken some artistic liberties with guessing how preferences would go. For example, in 2019, I gave this last seat to the shooters, fishers, and farmers. In the 2022 election, I gave the last seat in South Australia to the Nick Xenophon team. And in 2022, I gave a lot of these last seats to legalize cannabis. Something curious to note is that you do get some results where in 2019, the Labor Party was actually ahead on the two-party preferred in the House. But as you can see here, the political right, in inverted commas, you need 50% to win 5 seats. I'd say this comes down to the fact that there are some One Nation voters who actually preference Labor Party over the coalition. I know it's sort of dwindling over time. So it can happen where the quote-unquote right could win a majority of seats in the Senate, but whilst Labor winning the two-party preferred in the House. But I can't say that these would exactly be the results that you would have got. This is just a guess. This is just an estimate. And of course, maybe voters would adjust their vote a little differently if they knew the quota was lower. I doubt that they would adjust it that much. I think voters are pretty clueless about what actually goes on in the Senate. And of course, this would expand the ballot papers of the Senate probably downwards and also rightwards, because you have to elect 9 members per election or 18 if there's double dissolution. And because if there's a lower quota, a bit more minor parties would think that they have a chance, and therefore there'd be more minor parties probably on the ballot. So you would have bigger ballot papers. A lot of people would be annoyed about that, but we don't have group voting tickets anymore. So I don't think it's going to be, too bad. And they increase the number of members you need to form a party to like 1,500 and stuff like that. And the major parties are always trying to do things to stop minor parties getting elected. I don't think big ballot papers would really be a huge problem. So the system would produce a result that is not quite as good for Labor. You need 57 in order to get a majority here. And as you can see here, Labor have 50, including the Greens. And then if you have cannabis, that's 54. If you include Lambie, that's 56. And if you include independents, that's 58. So they only just sort of make up a majority with all sort of like center to left leaning independents. And when I posted this on my YouTube channel as a bit of a preview, someone noted how One Nation get 9 seats. Currently, they only have 2. And they sort of complained about that. Like they said, reject, reject, reject. My opinion is on that is that the right-wing minor party vote, and by the way, there's 12, including Palmer, of sort of right-wing minor parties, 13 if you include the shooters. But my opinion is that there is a significant amount of the population who do vote for a quote-unquote right-wing minor party, and I don't think it's fair to argue to disenfranchise them just because you don't like them. I think the Senate is meant to be a proportional system, and if they get that amount of votes, they're entitled to that amount of seats. So I wouldn't gatekeep an electoral system just because you don't like a certain party. In my opinion, the Senate does need to be slightly reformed. I think having 14 senators per state would be a good reform simply because you would have 7 seats for each state per half Senate election. And to win 4, you would need over 50% of the vote, which would provide a more sort of conclusive result every election because currently, almost all the time, we see in the Senate 3 left and 3 right seats, which means the Senate is really prone to gridlock because you rarely see the ability for a party or like a group of voters who get over 50% to really take advantage of that and capitalize on that fact to win more members in each state in the Senate each election. And it does lead to gridlock in the Senate. So yeah, I think that half Senate elections should elect a odd number of seats. But maybe some people like that stability. Maybe some people like that 3 left and 3 right. They think it means that like no side of politics, unless there's a huge mandate, get a strong stranglehold on the Senate. I guess that's an argument. I think it really just slows down sort of progress either way, in my opinion. Saying that this system does make it really difficult for the Labour Party. So I don't actually think this electoral change would actually be that large in the grand scheme of things for Australian elections. So, fun fact, the very first Australian election, I think they changed it for the second, but the very first Australian election actually also had multi-member constituencies in both Tasmania and South Australia. But it was done in this weird system that was called, I think, block voting or something like that. It's a really bad system. It wasn't really proportional representation, but it was multi-member electorates. So it isn't unheard of to see multi-member electorates in the House of Representatives. This doesn't have some kind of like parallel voting system like we see in MMP in New Zealand and Germany. You don't have to do 2 different votes in the House and then an extra vote in the Senate. It's basically asking the voter to vote 3 times. We don't have that. We just have a 1 ballot in the House that has between 3 and maybe 5 candidates per electorate, and then you have the Senate where it's 9 or 18, depending on if it's double dissolution. It actually makes voting in both houses pretty similar. I mean, in the Senate, you would need to increase the number of boxes probably that you have to fill in above the line, or make it compulsory preferential voting above the line. I honestly, I actually really hate voting above. I hate the idea of voting above the line. If they're gonna do it, as I said earlier, you gotta make it that independents can be voted for above the line. The stupid like no group box thing is so shitty towards independents. It's so unfair. They need to really reform that shit. I mean, it's the major parties wanting to sort of keep the status quo, of course. That's why that isn't the case. It's one of the worst things about our electoral system at the moment is the disenfranchisement of independents. But this isn't a huge change. Some people advocate for an MMP system or like parallel voting in Australia. I don't even know if that would be constitutional because there is something in the Constitution about in the House of Representatives, Australians only get 1 vote each. And of course, what they mean is that you're not supposed to go from booth to booth voting again and again and again. That's obviously what it means, but it could be interpreted by the High Court that you can't have a parallel voting system. But generally, I think the worst thing about a parallel voting system or an MMP system is it does disenfranchise local members and independents, it would inevitably make constituencies either larger or would mean a less number of candidates can be elected per constituency. Either way, it disenfranchises independents. I will maybe make a video one day about MMP and parallel voting. Parallel voting, like they have in Taiwan, is much preferable in my opinion to MMP. I really do not like MMP. I think it's a terrible, awful, contrived voting system, and one day I will make a video about why it's so bad. And those stupid thresholds are really stupid. So yeah, I don't think that kind of system would fly in Australia for good reason. And I think that this is a reasonable update to the current system. We're probably never going to see this. We're probably, if the parliament is ever expanded, we're probably just going to see more single member divisions. Someone like Kylie Tink, if she ever gets back into politics, might be happy with the fact that North Sydney comes back if they expand the parliament to 180. And it might be all right for people like the Greens and One Nation would have a better chance of winning seats, even if the parliament is expanded by 30 seats. And of course, in the Senate, One Nation would have better chances. The Greens don't really benefit that much from a larger Senate. There's a chance that the Greens can win possibly 2 seats in Tasmania. And of course, the Greens benefit from having larger territories where they can actually possibly win seats. I'd say the Greens could probably get like 3 seats in a double dissolution under this system in some states, but in half Senate elections, getting 2 seats would be very difficult, and it means the Greens are on similar numbers to what we see in the original Parliament in the current Senate, even though the current Senate is about a third smaller than this Senate. But I think the Greens wouldn't mind too much because it really makes up for their less proportion of the Senate with their higher proportion in the House. And it does give them some allies in the upper house in the form of the Cannabis Party. It definitely isn't all bad for the Greens. I think the Greens would definitely prefer a system like this. Just quickly, I wanted to add something. So you might see here that the House of Representatives can fit up to 240 members. So the 222, I suggest, would fit, but you might ask about, oh, what about joint sittings? Then you won't be able to fit people. So the way I sort of explain that away is say that, joint sittings only happen like, I don't know, once every 100 years or something like that. If the British Parliament can deal with like literally every sitting having like a billion people standing up, I think for a 1 in 100 year event, we could deal with having a joint sitting of 340 odd members. Like already, if we expanded the House of Representatives to 180, a joint sitting under that model would still be over 240. It would still be over the total that, according to Wikipedia, can be accommodated. So I don't think it's a big deal. I just think that the House of Representatives should probably cap out on its numbers at 240. Otherwise, you would probably have to like severely like renovate the House of Representatives, which I don't want to do. So that's my electoral reform, everyone. Thank you for watching. I still want to make videos on each state and territory for the federal election, and I want to make some videos about some issues, specifically housing and immigration. So lots to come on the channel. But before the election really kicks into a high gear, I just wanted to do this video. It also uses the old electorates map. So sue me, it's probably the last time you'll be seeing this kind of map from me on the channel, because the YAPMS map is kind of just better. It kind of puts my map to shame. But of course, the Senate visualization is always useful, because someone told me that you could do it on YAPMS, but I don't think it would look as good as just what we've got here, which is, it's pretty clear what's going on in my Senate visualization. So thank you for watching, everyone. Tell me in the comments what you think of my electoral system, if it's good, if it's bad, if you would endorse it. And of course, you don't have to tell me that this would never happen, because I know the Labor Party would hate this, the Coalition would hate this, so it will never happen. But it's fun to suggest things, and for me to get the word out there on how the Australian electoral system could be better. Goodbye, everyone.